Again, my name is Barb Mays-Baustad from the Warning Decision Training Division, and I'm going to lead us through this forecast discussion webinar. I'm going to keep all your lines unmuted because this is meant to be a discussion. So by all means, feel free to chime in and point out features, give your thoughts, or talk about forecast items of interest, if you will. I'd like this to be more of a discussion than me just talking. I think it's more effective that way. But I do have a few things I'll show to get discussions kicked off and started, and I guess a small reminder, if you can mute your own phone on your own end, that'll help keep background noise to a minimum, since I'm going to keep all the lines unmuted. And I am starting with showing yesterday's forecasts. I don't know if anybody chimed in, but we had an all NWS forecast challenge call yesterday to discuss this. So we had two areas of interest yesterday, one up here in the, say, northern high plains into Montana, another area of interest down in western Texas Panhandle or West Texas into eastern Oklahoma. We put more of our focus here. Oh, I actually just clicked right on my point, too. We put more of our focus here in Montana, where there is expected to be some early development of storms that could have the capability of producing hail, followed by a bit of a wind threat as storms evolved. And you can see from the reports, it did evolve pretty much in that fashion. The east or the western edge of our thunderstorm reports yesterday in Montana were dominated by hail before transitioning to wind a little further downstream. Of course, there was a heavy cluster in the populated areas, a little cluster here by Billings, another cluster up here by Miles City, and then another cluster way up here to the north, a little bit between Glasgow and Williston, and a little more scattered here throughout, maybe another little cluster here in the high plains. So some folks hit some significant hail yesterday in this area, and there was not a tornado to be had, but there weren't that many tornado forecasts either. A little further south, yesterday Jim Ledoux and I talked about this area as being pretty complicated because of an MCS that came blasting through Oklahoma yesterday, pushing easterly flow well back into the Texas Panhandle. And sure enough, it pushed the thunderstorm development a little south and west. So wind dominated the reports out here, but there were some reports in that area. And then if anybody was looking for real outliers, there were a couple of reports in Florida and a couple of reports in Indiana yesterday. So we're well into the contest, still some points to be had for those who are still trying to get the points. But I'm going to go ahead and start taking a look at today. I'll walk through a bit of a forecast funnel process and some of the things at least that caught my attention for focus. And then I'd really like to hear some perspectives from those of you who are out there, and hopefully a couple of you will speak up pretty willingly. Otherwise, I've got a class list, and I'll start calling out on you. So looking first at the 250 millibar flow, and across much of the United States, there just remains not a lot of flow to be had. This is really a pretty classic summer, mid-summer type of pattern with relatively weak jet, or the jet pushed far north into Canada. Not much to be had across a large section of the CONUS. At 500 millibars, we're seeing this ridging in the central United States that's been fairly persistent, but there are troughs riding around, shortwave troughs riding around the ridge, one out west here, one in the Dakotas to Nebraska here, a couple others pocketed around. So these are at least some areas of interest and focus, and of course the shortwave ridging in between, perhaps areas that could suppress convective activity where we maybe otherwise think of development. Looking at 850, there is a fair amount of moisture to be had out there. We are channeling it up from the Gulf. Here's a nice fetch here from the Gulf of Mexico through Texas, fairly moist coming into the Central Plains and even up to the High Plains. And one thing that catches my attention, at least on the 12C here, is this nice bend going from south to southwesterly flow here, even though it's weak at North Platte, to almost due easterly here at Rapid City. So definitely a boundary in between, some pooling of moisture there around the Black Hills and in Wyoming. So little, perhaps, ripple of interest there to keep an eye on, both for the transport of moisture into this area and potential for some development later today. On looking at a surface chart just from the last hour that I pulled up, which was 1700, I'm sure the 1800 is actually up by now. In fact, I'll hit refresh, and it is. Again, you can see this southeasterly fetch of surface flow across Nebraska and into South Dakota. Dew points in the upper 60s to around 70 in Nebraska, getting into the mid to upper 60s here in South Dakota. That's pretty good moisture for the high plains of the Dakotas. 60s transporting themselves all the way up into even eastern Montana. You can also see the evidence of a surface low or surface trough here with a wind direction and certainly drier dew points behind it. In fact, there's quite a dew point gradient on the high plains of Wyoming here near the Rockies there. But a little bit of convergence, but surface flow is awfully weak out there, which is going to make the tornado threat maybe a little more of an interesting accidental potential, if anything. I'll give a first peek at the SPC outlook. We have an enhanced risk there today, and the enhanced risk driven mainly by the threat of wind. 15% risk for hail with a hatched area around the Black Hills there in southwestern South Dakota. And tornado probability exists in southeast South Dakota as well, along with a couple other little pockets of interest. When I approached this forecast, I started looking at it last night, actually. I tend to do my forecasting the night before just because it's when I often have some time to sit and look. But this is looking at the 12Z HRF guidance, so looking at what you would have seen this morning if you came in and wanted to make your forecast. Looking here first at surface-based CAPE, and I don't think CAPE is too much of a problem in this area today. Most solutions bring CAPE well above 2,000 and even above 3,000 into the southern South Dakota area, so it gives us at least one of the ingredients that we may be seeking. Where do I want to go next? Look at a little bit of, since I'm on postage stamps, I want to stick with postage stamps for a minute, looking at reflectivity, just to get a feel for the scope of different solutions, and seeing that we have the potential for development in the mid to late afternoon in the Black Hills or somewhere near it, starting as something that's more isolated or multicellular and perhaps growing upscale into an MCS through the night. This is not all that different from what we were looking at yesterday, just a little bit further to the west, and introduces different types of hazards depending on whether you're looking more on the early side of that development or how it evolves through the evening and into the overnight hours. This isn't really striking me as a big tornado type of setup. Not that they can't happen, but if we look at our 0 to 1 kilometer SRH for this area, ensemble mean, it's just kind of spotty and not all that significant in the Black Hills area. Very, very splotchy pockets of maybe 50 to 100 meters squared per second squared, 0 to 1 helicity. So, something of perhaps really small scale interest, but I just don't know if we're going to realize a whole lot of threat there. I'll go ahead and pull up some updraft helicity. I like the paintballs today. And let that load. Just to get a feel for where the threats may be for more of that initial development of good, sustained, rotating updrafts. We can see some clustering here in South Dakota, really just east of the Black Hills area, at least in this 12Z run. Perhaps some early development over the Black Hills. I'm thinking maybe this rolls off the terrain a bit and gets going here. Decent probabilities of realizing at least 75 meters squared per second squared of updraft helicity here, along with the weirdness of Iowa that if you listened to our conference call yesterday, I was also there yesterday and didn't get realized with convection. So my confidence in this area is a little low just based on past behavior. This does, carry some interest, though, here, that there's this potential for some organized supercellular type convection before things progress across Nebraska through the night. Looking again at, I'm going to look first at the NamNest 12Z, again thinking about what might have been available when we were making forecasts this morning before the deadline. Just to give a quick peek at the composite radar reflectivity, one model, one solution, one idea here. Develops 2 areas of convection by mid to late afternoon. The first here in that area that's just east of the Black Hills, and then a little area of convection here too in eastern Wyoming, a little more in the high plains. If we push this forward a few hours, getting to about 3Z, that convection that was in eastern Wyoming goes through a cycle and seems to lose its push diurnally, while we get a little more of MCS development from the central South Dakota thunderstorms, looking like a classic MCS pushing across Nebraska through the overnight hours there. And as you can imagine, the corresponding wind gusts associated with a look like that sure looks like some kind of windy thing moving across Nebraska through the overnight hours. I won't show them here, but a couple of runs of the NamNest generally had something that did look like that for several runs now. Where they exactly initiate the convection and push the subsequent MCS was a little different, but they all showed that kind of evolution. If we look for the HER here, the latest I don't think is going to be in, well, it's maybe in far enough to look for development at least. It also shows a couple areas of development here, one in eastern Wyoming, the other in central to southwest-ish South Dakota. Initial development more on the single-cell to multi-cell side before things congeal into an MCS that becomes more of a windy threat. I grabbed a couple of point soundings. Thought I would show them. The first one is more of that, the westernmost convective area, the eastern Wyoming type convection. A little more saturated at the boundary layer and pretty low LCL actually. Substantial mid-level lapse rates of, what is it, 8.7, about 8.5 to 9 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So I'd certainly look at this and be thinking hail if I was looking at that sounding. I do note that the effective shear might be at, the effective bulk wind difference might be at 42 knots, but the look of it is awfully weak in the low to mid levels and just doesn't do a whole lot to impress me. So again, I don't, from this sounding, I don't see a whole lot screaming. I need to be too careful about tornadoes here. It's got the look of sounding that goes into messy modes too, with that sort of straight look to it. If I take a sounding a little bit further east, ahead of the central South Dakota convection, this is a 1Z sounding. A couple things that stand out to me here. The wind flow is at least a little more realistic and continuous. Still effective shear around 35 knots, give or take, so that's not so bad. The mid-level lapse rates here are just a little bit less steep. They're below 8.5, but 8.5 is, 8 to 8.5 is still a pretty substantial mid-level lapse rate. This intrigues me, though, this well-mixed boundary layer, the almost inverted V look to the sounding, combined with decay for almost 1700. I can see where this starts to think wind quickly after development, and again, thinking as the storms grow upscale into an MCS, this could present a wind threat. I'll show one last sounding here with a mid-level lapse rate of over 9 Celsius per kilometer. The moisture in this sounding is not as great. And again, that mid-level flow is just awfully weak, but perhaps a pulsy type of sounding here, perhaps something that's able to go up and quickly produce some hail and wind and collapse. Now this sounding I happen to take in Texas today. Let me go back to the models, and I don't know if anybody looked much at Texas before making your decision. I do know that nobody picked a point there, at least among this group. But if I pull the HER back, well, I don't want to be quite that zoomed in. If I pull the HER back here and give this a look, some of the models and some of the runs have been developing convection somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, again, starting as a cellular convection before developing it into more of a linear or not quite MCS type look, but certainly more of an upscale type of convective activity. So if you were thinking secondary targets or looking for other areas, Texas might have been one that caught your eye. And if you look at the whole Weather Service Forecast Challenge group, some people did put points down in that area. So let's talk about where our forecasts are. You can see that there is a small area here of a marginal risk that does extend into Texas, but we all picked points in South Dakota, whether we picked them a little further west or a little further east. I see a cluster of wind types points that are close to Valentine here, a cluster of hail perhaps by Rapid City. What I'd love to hear at this point is anyone who wants to speak up and maybe tell me where your point is and your thought process for where you went and why.
Hi, I'll chime in here.
Okay, who are you?
This is Jason from Fort Worth. I put my forecast point in Valentine right there and wind for the type. And kind of the main thing I was looking at is this morning I had to analyze what looks to be kind of a warm front or quasi-stationary front roughly along I-90 there. And you'll probably get some convection first develop out towards the Badlands. You can see there's a little more, the moisture gradient was a little sharper there this morning. It's kind of spread out a little bit this afternoon. I think the front's kind of surged northward. But anyway, you have really good boundary layer moisture down there. So thinking get some storms develop around the Badlands, Black Hills area. And then the storm motion should bring it kind of just south of the Nebraska-South Dakota state line late tonight. And just, I agree with what you showed on those soundings where you have really steep theta E-last rates, large D tape, and almost dry adiabatic in some soundings, 8.4. I saw one that was like 8.8 feet per kilometer and the lowest 3 kilometers there. So certainly it just looks like your classic, summer northern plains MCS kind of situation.
Sure does. I actually did the same and put my point for wind in Valentine as well.
Right.
Does anybody want to talk about perhaps the decision to go hail versus wind and how you went one way or the other?
Hi, Barb. This is Christina from Albany.
Hi, Christina. Would you like to talk about it?
Sure. So I did hem and haw between hail and wind, but I really decided to go hail because when I was looking at the forecast soundings between like 23Z and 2Z tonight, the amount of cape, fat cape between -10 and -30 really caught my eye. So that was really my prime reason for going hail versus wind. I also thought there'd be greater potential to get a significant hailstone given the ship index was so high. So that was kind of my motivation to go hail versus wind. Another reason I chose not to go wind was just the fact that the area in question of where the potential MCS would travel through is not very densely populated. And I mean, yes, there are some ASOS sites and maybe some Mesonet sites there, but I was a little nervous of maybe not getting a significant wind report given the lack of observations or in lack of densely population. So that was kind of my issue. But I am a little concerned with the hail because majority of my circle, the 25-mile radius circle, does include the Indian reservation in South Dakota. So I'm not exactly sure the relationship that exists between folks who live on those reservations and reporting severe weather with the National Weather Service. So I wasn't really sure, but I assumed maybe it's a Friday night, people are at the casino on the Indian reservation, so maybe we'll get some reports that way. But that was kind of my motivation to go hail versus wind.
That's a great discussion of both meteorological and non-meteorological factors. And for those who are, if you're not used to looking for the ship on the sounding, if you can follow my cursor down here near the bottom, there's a little box that's next to all the lapse rates, and at the bottom of that is your ship, your significant hail potential. Good. Does anybody else want to share some thoughts on your point in your discussions? Oh, and Christina, where did your point go?
I put mine, whatever the highway was that extends north from Valentine, Nebraska north into South Dakota. I forgot what the highway name was, but it was kind of near, I think, like White River, South Dakota, just south of there. I think in between White River and Mission, South Dakota, whatever the highway was. I try to stick with a road network and try to have as many cities as possible within my little circle. But that was, whatever the highway was, it was over there.
I found you there. Very good. You're by Mission, South Dakota. All right. Any others who want to share your thoughts in making the forecast today or yesterday, if yesterday was an interesting one for you?
Hey, Barb. Phil.
Hi, Phil. I hear two of you chime in. I'll go Phil first, and then the second person who is going to speak.
Yeah, I think that my reasoning, I did kind of see the two threats, the initial hail threat with the development of South Dakota, and then the eventual wind threat probably later on. I ended up going wind also in Valentine. I thought that I was a little unsure of where the initiation location might be today, so I figured the hail location would be a little smaller area. So given the pretty clear signal in the cams of some upscale growth, the location of that seemed a little bit more reliable. So I went with the wind threat further east. The NAM I'm looking at right now shows kind of the strengthening low-level jet pushing into central Nebraska this evening, so that will probably help sustain the convection as it pushes east and southeast. So that was kind of my reasoning.
Okay, that's also a good analysis too. That initial development, just by the nature of it being more scattered, single cell to multicellular, could be a little tougher to nail a location down. And there was someone else who chimed up about the same time as Phil.
Corey here in Sacramento.
Hi, Corey.
I ended up going hail also. I went for Martin, South Dakota. Similar reasons, good high cape in the hail growth zone. Also, steep lapse rates led me to the hail threat. I do think it'll grow upscale to an MCS once it pushes east and become more of a wind threat. That's why I went further west, kind of when it's singular cell yet before upscale growth. And I think it'll be more of a hail threat in that area. So hopefully we'll get some hail reports there.
All right. Did anybody consider going Texas and nope out of it? Or were you all pretty confident you were going to be in South Dakota or Nebraska today? Sounds like we all were going to go South Dakota or Nebraska. Did anybody go to Texas yesterday?
Hi, Barb. I actually went southwest Oklahoma yesterday, but I failed.
Well, let's talk about that. Failures are good to learn from.
Yeah, I was too far north. I went Elk City, Oklahoma, on I-40, and I went wind because the inverted V was really impressive to me, and I thought there was a vortex in the Oklahoma Panhandle earlier in the day, and a lot of the models were showing it rounding the top of the ridge axis and kind of going into southwestern Oklahoma, and then there was the leftover MCS in central Oklahoma, and there was a lot of heating to its west, so I thought maybe some differential heating boundaries would also aid in leading to convection. And with the inverted V sounding, I think the high temperature was near 100, and then the dew point was like 60, so there were some really good D-cape values. I think it was like 1,500, so I was hoping to bank on differential heating from the cloud coverage in central Oklahoma and then clearing to its west, vortex, and then the inverted V. So I thought, all right, let's go wind, but I failed.
There was, this is Phil again. I was working last night in Norman, and we were noticing there was a really interesting wake low behind the convection in Texas. And we actually had some severe wind gusts well removed from the convection in southwest Oklahoma last night.
Oh, really? And how come I didn't see any report? Maybe it was, I put my point in Elk City.
Yeah, they were non-thunderstorms, so we don't count them as
okay,
an LSR. But
okay.
We actually issued a high wind warning, like midnight or after last night, for just kind of widespread wind.
Oh, okay. That's good information. Maybe it wasn't a total fail after all.
It's, with the NCS yesterday, it just really pushed things further than a lot of those points would have been forecasting for western Oklahoma yesterday. And you can see that you had company in that area. There were certainly a number of people even in the challenge and certainly in the Weather Service-wide grouping that forecast in this area. And there were reports down here, but this area kind of got blasted out. Okay. Does anybody have any other parameters you wanted me to pull up to look at for today's forecast? while you're thinking on that, I'm going to pull up some eye candy and show a little bit of what is going on today. So we have a Q field that's doing its thing in southwestern South Dakota. Little boundary here evident on satellite, and storm going up there in far western South Dakota, so perhaps our convective initiation getting going here. Also a little bit going on the mountains in Wyoming there. A little bit of Q in Iowa. I don't trust Iowa, though, when it comes to convection anyway. So we have the beginnings here of our, I think, our initiation, looking at the mesoanalysis, a little bit of moisture conversions going on at the surface in southwestern South Dakota, not surprisingly. Our mid-level cape, at least according to analysis, has become uncapped in the area and well above 3,000 joules per kilogram. So I think we're looking at imminent convective initiation in that area. I'm going to check out our mid-level lapse rates. I'm a big fan of mid-level lapse rates when looking for hail threats, and some of those forecast sounding values being realized now down in southwestern South Dakota. So all in all, I think we're getting ready here for our hail threats and eventual wind threats in the area. Tornado threat, a little more questionable, and I noticed that nobody went tornado today. Did anybody consider it and then nope out of it? That sounds like a nope as well. And that's interesting too, because it isn't, it's a non-zero threat today. There is some potential that something can spin up and get a tornado going. And when you're trying to get points in the game, tornadoes are good for that. But I think for me, I just come back to this surface field, and it's just not. It's backed, which is a plus, but it speeds there and just above the surface just aren't lighting my world on fire.
This is Katie in Houston. That's generally my my viewpoint too. I try and start with tornado just to see if there's any areas that are favorable. Similarly, I didn't see a wind profile that really impressed me. You could get some local enhancement along the boundary there, but I didn't feel confident enough to place a point anywhere.
Yeah, very good. Well, I don't have a whole lot else to say about the forecast potential for today, but I'd certainly like to hear if anybody else has any thoughts you want to share today or heading in through this week. Are there any other days of interest you want to talk about? This is our last chance to talk to you as part of these webinars, and we're here to share items of interest with you, but hopefully hear some items of interest from you too. So, anybody? Okay, well, I won't hold you on for overtime then. I'll linger just a moment in case anybody has any questions, but other than that, thanks for participating in the Forecast Challenge, and we're a couple weeks away from the end, but scores can change pretty drastically when people replace the low scores with higher ones, so still a lot of room for moving around in the rankings. Have fun, and go for wind and Valentine today. Thanks, everybody.